A slide reads Interactive and Personalized Literacy for Students Who Are Deafblind, Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project, Susan M. Bruce, PhD.
So my name is Heidi Hollenberger, and I'm with the Deafblind Project, and this is part of our Empowering Intervener series. Super excited to have you guys all here, and super duper excited to have Dr. Susan Bruce with us, Professor Emeritus, Boston College. And she will be presenting on interactive and personalized literacy for students who are deafblind. So Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to meet with all of you today. So, the title for tonight's talk is Interactive and Personalized Literacy for Students Who Are Deafblind. And I have been told that the target audience is interveners, but that there will be other professionals joining us tonight. So, I welcome your questions. I'll try to pause after each of the topics that I'm going to discuss with you. So, our objectives for tonight are that participants will be able to explain the importance of personalized literacy lessons. I'm actually going to differentiate the terms individualized from personalized. They have two different meanings. The second objective is that participants will understand key considerations such as the role of experience, saliency, and distancing, which I'll define later in my talk, when they select materials and also when implementing these personalized literacy lessons. And the third objective is that participants will become familiar with instructional strategies to implement several personalized literacy lessons. And the three that I'm going to talk with you tonight about are story boxes, experience books, also known as experience stories, and interactive or shared reading. So some people call it interactive reading, some people call it shared reading. So I need to begin by giving some background information because it really grounds everything we do. There are just some concepts that are so important that I can't really dive into the lessons themselves until we address these. So the field of deafblindness has adopted an expanded view of literacy. So whereas the general population tends to think of literacy as something that happens after you've developed language, we have developed a view of literacy that is inclusive of all learners at all levels of communication development. So we include pre-linguistic learners in this view of literacy then. We also think of literacy as going beyond print or braille to include other types of representations, such as objects, and I'll show you an example later on. We include in this expanded view low and high technologies. So speech generating devices is a high technology, a low technology could be our object representations that some people call tangible symbols. And then read alouds would be another. Read alouds are when someone else reads to the child who's deafblind, as distinguished from shared reading. Shared reading is also known as interactive reading, as I said a moment ago. In shared reading, both the child who's deafblind and the person who's sharing with them in that literacy event have distinct roles. And of course, the intervener and teachers will define who is going to do what doing shared reading. And these shared readings can also involve multiple forms of communication or modes. So you may hear me use modes or use forms. They mean the same thing when we're talking about ways that people communicate. All right. We also, of course, need interveners to educate others about this expanded view of literacy. And please, if you ever hear anyone say that a child doesn't communicate, please step in and be an advocate. I hope we don't have to hear that very often, but every now and then it does come up and it's very upsetting to hear. Another key concept is literacy-rich environments. So school professionals, as part of this literacy-rich environment, need to explain the reasons for their own literacy activities. Because if you're deaf-blind, you don't have as many opportunities to observe this through your vision and through your hearing. So you might not hear people muttering about their grocery list, or you might not see what they're doing with computer literacy. So we need to make that more explicit to the children so they understand why other people engage in literacy. So remember, two key concepts I can bring up right here would be observational learning and incidental learning. They are different in meaning. So observational learning happens when, as the root word indicates, you observe something. And typically you observe at somewhat of a distance, but not always. And you're observing through your vision or your hearing. Those are our observational senses. Therefore, if you're deafblind, you have far fewer opportunities to learn through observation. The second concept then is incidental learning. Incidental learning is when you learn something, but oh geez, you didn't really set out to learn it. I don't want to call it accidental, but you kind of picked up things, like maybe some words you picked up from an older sibling or a kid down the block that your parents might not have appreciated. You didn't set out, maybe on the walk to school, to listen in on other people and pick up their vocabulary that might not be acceptable in your home, but you picked it up. It was incidental. So, also because of deaf blindness, the children we care about and work with have fewer opportunities to learn incidentally. They don't learn without much, they don't learn unless there's more direct instruction and opportunities that are crafted for them. In other words, it doesn't happen just by happenstance. That's not what occurs for kids who are deafblind. And I am recognizing, of course, that about 90% of the learners on our national census of deaf blindness do have some functional vision or hearing. But even if you have low vision, you're still gleaning bits and pieces of information instead of the same observational or incidental learning opportunities that a hearing sighted child would have. Another point then is that we need interveners then to model also, as well as parents, how they engage in literacy. We need sufficient literacy materials across environments that are kept in a predictable location known to the child. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. We need to think about different types of literacy. Of course, we need to engage in shared readings where the kids are reading partners with us or have some kind of active role. And you might look at some of the information written by Mackenzie on visual impairments and kids with multiple disabilities and literacy, or the Paths to Literacy website would be another good source. And I'll show you a resource from that site later. So as I've been in the field quite a while and I've published quite often in deaf blindness, I came up with this term. It is mine. It's kind of funny that way. I just thought I would call certain lessons classic literacy lessons, and some others have bought into that. So what I'm really saying by saying these are classic literacy lessons is that these are literacy lessons that every team serving children who are deafblind must know how to develop and implement with excellence. These are key lessons that support them in various challenges that they uniquely experience as individuals who are deafblind. So the lessons that I've listed here are story boxes, experience books, shared reading, also known as interactive learning. The fourth is daily schedules, also known as calendar systems. And the next one is journals that are interactive and that address distancing, and I'll explain that in a while. So that lesson is crafted to develop ways to teach them distancing. And then the one I added most recently is authentic choice making. Authentic to me means the kid knows what the options are, has the experiences to ground the choice making experience. So I differentiate between offering a choice making opportunity and authentic choice making, where the child really understands what's going on and makes true selections based on preferences. So tonight we're going to talk about three of them: story boxes, experience books, and shared reading. So what are the goals then of these literacy lessons? We work on sharing attention, or joint attention. We share positive affect emotions with the students. We're exposing them to language. We are building concepts. We might even build in repetition of certain key concepts within a single literacy lesson. We're going to make sure that they get plenty of experiences with literacy skills as they become ready. So ideas like the main point or main idea of a story, characters, and so on. But a lot will happen before we do that. We will be building communication skills, including key vocabulary. So communication grows in the context of well-constructed and delivered literacy lessons. We will build and share memories. So the student and intervener, and I'll explain more about that when I talk about bodily emotional traces in a little bit. We will also think about writing experiences more broadly and that they can occur across modes and forms. I'll show you a picture in a while of a sequence of objects. That's a form of writing, deaf blindness. We will also be thinking about book handling skills that the teacher of students with visual impairment, the TVI, will know a lot about and how to teach those. And I'm sure there's some other skills that you might think of as well that we could address in the context of literacy lessons. So as I go through these ideas on the past two slides, it should be striking us that interveners are absolutely critical to the achievement of each of these goals. And many of the enrichment experiences that you provide to the child or the pre-teaching that you do with a child who might be participating in the general curriculum, all of those involve shared memories that can be expressed in literacy materials. So let's think a little bit then about these key concepts, and I'll go through each one in subsequent slides because they ground everything we do. If you understand these, then you should be able to craft the lessons that I'm going to describe in a little while. So experience is everything. It's like in choice making. If you hold up two options and the child doesn't have experience with those options, then they're meaningless. And then the choice making experience is no longer authentic. Their selection was not authentic. Distancing, I'm going to explain in a minute. I'll talk with you about saliency, individualization, personalization, and a little bit on joint attention. So let me get into each of those concepts now. So the children who are deafblind need rich experiences like anyone else needs rich experiences to learn, and they must be repeated. And we do this to build communication skills, including vocabulary, but also to build concepts. Remember that when you share an experience with them, like going to the park or the family takes them to the zoo, the way that they experience that particular activity or setting is not the same as what you experience, maybe because of your age or your role, but also because you're hearing sighted or you're deaf with typical vision and so on. So when we share experiences, the Europeans have developed this concept called bodily emotional traces. So this means that when we experience something that's active, say the intervener and the child are doing something fun and they're playing together and there's a lot of physicality to it, the body in motion combined with strong emotions, and we hope that they're generally positive, but it works when they happen to have negative emotions too. This combination of the body and movement and emotion defines what bodily emotional is. And then we talk about traces. So the memory is impacted then by body movement and by emotion. And these bodily emotional traces are more easily pulled up. They reduce the cognitive load, so to speak, and they are more easily pulled up in memory. So these experiences then we link to personalized literacy, and I'll touch on that a little bit as we get into those classic lessons. So interveners, because they have a role, as I said, in pre-teaching or demonstrating something and do a lot in movement with the children, have a perfect opportunities then to create these bodily emotional traces with the child. And when we represent those experiences in personalized literacy, It is especially great if the person who shared the actual experience is also sharing the literacy experience later that reflects on that experience. So the child knows, oh, I shared that with you, and now we're referencing that. All right. Distancing is a concept that was developed by Werner and Kaplan, renowned psychologists. Their work was very, very much influencing Van Dyke's development of the child guided approach. But this idea of distancing was kind of left behind. And so for me, it's really important to talk about this. And this distancing happens to all of us as communicators, but it's just less apparent in a hearing sighted child. It might happen quite quickly. So there's different types of distancing that they talked about and that I wrote about around '05, in '05, two different articles on it. So in the beginning, we have distancing between ourselves and objects, even to the point of understanding our body is different than our parents' body. We're separate beings. Understanding when we're in a bassinet that we're not actually an extension of the bassinet, we are in the bassinet. So that's an early type of distancing. Then we have something that's more advanced. We call it middle distancing, which is a separation in the resemblance between a referent and what represents it. So you have the referent and then you have the representation. The representation stands for the referent. Okay. So we do not understand abstract representations and we misuse the word symbol. Symbols are always abstract. And I'll touch on that again when we talk about tangible symbols, which are indeed not always symbolic. Later on, distancing involves separation in time and space between that referent and the representation, meaning that this child is thinking about something, the referent. For example, maybe they know 10 signs, and one of them is for this particular referent. And this referent is something that belongs in their classroom space. They go to the gymnasium space, and they make that sign. Oh, I get so excited when I see something like that. That is an excellent example of distancing. So they no longer had to be anchored with the object itself, right? Or it could be a person, like they might sign a person's name because they understand that person is still existing, even though they're not in the same space with that person any longer. This is important and relates to the sharing of things that happen at school when the child is at home and vice versa. And we can teach toward that happening. I've done it many times. So the distance senses of vision and hearing are super helpful to the achievement of distancing. It isn't all that special in hearing sighted children, but it's something very special and challenging for children who are deafblind, especially congenitally deafblind. So using abstract representations, which are known as symbols, does not alone make for symbolic communication, nor does it mean you are now linguistic. Some people confuse this. They think that once you understand and can use symbols, which are abstract representations, you are linguistic. No, no, no. The missing piece is distancing. And that's why, because there's such a great effect in deafblindness, we must come to understand it and learn how to teach distancing then. All right. Next concept, saliency. So I'm thinking about how we're going to select representations, whether they are symbols or not. And they shouldn't be symbols in the beginning. So we will select representations for an activity, an experience that represents what the child thought was most important. In other words, it's from the child's point of view. So you have to really kind of turn off your sense of your own perceptions as you consider this. It isn't about how you define the park or how you define the zoo. It's how the child defined it. Just like many of us have had the experience of realizing that they define each professional in a different way. They have different ideas of what our roles are. So we have to pay attention to what's salient. What I'm actually saying to you is it will be easier for them to learn a representation if you honor the principle of saliency. Much easier. And this idea of saliency applies across forms, modes, such as objects, pictures, and the key vocabulary that you represent. You will determine saliency by watching what the child shows interest in, maybe what they spend the most time doing, and you'll watch for their emotional reactions. So if you're in the park, what did they do in the park? Did they sit and run sand across their hand for a long time and draw pleasure from that? Was it more the slide experience that they enjoyed and showed emotion in? So we're thinking again about bodily emotional traces too. And so we represent using saliency as a guiding principle, and this will help the child to make meaning and to build communication skills. It will, again, reduce memory load. You know, we use our vision and hearing a great deal to pull up memories, don't we? But we don't necessarily appreciate that. So saliency then applies to the development of personalized story boxes and to all experience books. And again, interveners often do this work. So I know, I'm still in schools quite a bit assessing children and supporting the building of programs. I saw 2 kids this past week, in fact, in different cities and different states. And although the teacher is supposed to develop the lessons, I do find that oftentimes interveners are having to do some of that work. So it's important for you to understand this. And also, if you have this content knowledge, then you can support others to develop personalized literacy lessons that are appropriate and that honor saliency. Because we make a lot of mistakes here because we have trouble thinking from another perspective. Our vision is so powerful, especially in the selection of what we attend to. So we want to give a lot of thought to that. So when you select representations, you're going to know your students' level of communication. Okay, you're going to know how they define an experience. You're going to think about saliency. There are actually 3 levels of representations. Field of Autism understands this. They use the word icon a great deal. We should be. So an icon then is the easiest to understand representation because it shares a resemblance with what it represents, which is called the referent. So it could be an actual object, the object itself. It could be a duplicate object. Those would be the easiest to understand. And some simple pictures are iconic. Line drawings are not iconic. They are not icons. An index is the one that I think we have the most trouble with, and I think it shifts in meaning a little bit when the child is primarily a tactile learner, but I won't get into that. That's a whole conversation. But an index shares an association with a referent, and I'll show you an example in a minute. So we often use that in a categorical way, like we might represent art class with a paintbrush, but that doesn't mean that every time we have art class, we paint. But the child develops an association between the paintbrush and perhaps the art teacher or the art location in the classroom or the art room. So that's learning by association. A symbol is always abstract. It does not feel like or necessarily look like the referent that it represents. Therefore, when we talk about tangible symbols, including the commercially produced sets, some of them may be iconic. Some of them could be an index, indices for short, and some may be symbols. So we have a misnomer in the field that I think misguides us. And sometimes I'm torn with just, should I give up trying to clarify this or should I keep on? But people tell me that once they understand the importance of starting with icons with early communicators, they see greater gains in the children's communication skills. And so I still go at it, I guess we could say. So again, tangible symbols may or may not be symbols. They may not be symbolic. And interveners need to collaborate with others to select then appropriate representations. So saliency is one thing, understanding the appropriate level of representation for your student is another thing. So we want to know, what do they understand and what is your evidence that they understand icons, indices, or symbols. And if you don't have evidence, then start with the icon anyway. So this slide then, I have a number of pictures in this presentation. So I'll show you the picture and then I'll go to the next slide because we should have descriptions of any visual materials like this. And so I've done that in this presentation. So this is an example of an iconic tangible representation that was drawn from one of my research studies. So the slide shows a clipboard on which a large envelope is placed, and the child actually did deliveries using these envelopes then. Next, we have an example of an it representation that would be in the category of being an index. The slide shows a piece of chain from a schoolyard swing, but its label says playground. So the child does things other than swinging on the playground, but maybe we've selected this piece of chain because the swinging evokes a lot of happiness in the child. So now we get that bodily emotional traces, the body and movement and great happiness. And we're also thinking about saliency, perhaps, because the child's way of thinking about the playground is to prioritize swinging. So this one would then be an index because it represents a broader concept of playground then. This slide shows part of a set of three-dimensional symbols. These are symbols. These are abstract. The only one that is less abstract would be, well, I wouldn't say it is, this eat one because there's like a straw, but it doesn't represent drink. But these are highly symbolic. These are really advanced. I know we have two camps of thinking, and one is to start with symbols and practice, practice, practice. Maybe the kids will learn them. And some people believe that, but a lot of teachers and interveners say, oh boy, no, this isn't working. So I really need to be transparent that I believe in meeting the child where they are and teaching a little bit above where they are. And I don't think that that robs them of my viewing them as competent. I think it gives them a chance to be successful. So, but it's important that I clarify my stance on that. So this was a symbol system used by a child in another state. So it shows abstract tactile symbols that are made of plastic and mounted on or into the background pieces of plastic that are in different shapes to represent different categories. And each symbol is labeled in print. We label things in print so that the adults say the same thing, right? It's like the naming principle. We want the children to hear the name of something frequently, and it would be best if they hear the same name for the same representation. All right. So next, I want to talk with you about individualized and personalized literacy. It's been probably about maybe 12 years that I've been differentiating these, and I did do an article on it, but I have to credit the early childhood field for having differentiated these two terms a long time ago. And when I was reading literature in their field, it occurred to me that we need to claim this in deaf blindness because we are really good at personalizing literacy. So let me explain the difference. First, individualizing literacy lessons. When we individualize, we provide all of the modifications, so changes in content, and all of the accommodations the learner needs to engage well in the lesson. We have also appropriately prepared all of the literacy materials for accessibility. We have provided appropriate positioning for the learner and for the reading partner, which might be one of us. We are implementing instructional strategies that are suitable for each child who's deaf-blind. And of course, this kind of information should be appearing on their individualized education plan, the IEP. Interveners always individualize their instruction based on what they know about the child's needs. Now let's go on to the second concept, which is personalizing or personalized. Personalizing literacy lessons means this. Personalized literacy is always about the child or adult's life experiences, or we might say their lived experiences. This is critical, especially in the early literacy development of children who are deafblind because of their reduced observational and incidental learning. You see, when it's personalized, they've already lived it. So the content is now familiar, and you have reduced the cognitive demand on them, allowing them to shine in the literacy event and show what they know, to have more confidence and comfort, and to build their communication skills. So these experiences undergird meaning making for all of us. Have you ever taken like a test, like even when we took SATs or graduate record exam, if you got a reading passage about something you were familiar with, it was like, a little sigh of relief, like, okay, I know this topic, I'm going to do well here. If you got something that was totally foreign topic to you, then you're going to struggle more and you're not going to do as well. So that's true for all of us. So we can grow as a field of deafblindness in understanding about personalized literacy and also connecting it as a culturally affirming pedagogy as we share traditions and experiences of families that might be different from our own experiences. And the intervener will know quite a bit about the learner's experiences as well as other staff members who might, for example, read a note from mom or dad from home, sharing what the child did in the family home over the weekend, perhaps. All right, so let's think a little bit about multiple senses and exploration, and then soon we'll take a little pause for questions. So most children, as I said earlier, who are deafblind, about 90% of them have some functional vision or hearing. So they are most often experiencing tactual exploration paired with one or more additional senses. And that can be helpful, but it's still parts to whole learning, which I'll touch on. Multiple senses and tactile, visual, and auditory features of objects will be experienced. So like an orange, if you think of an orange, maybe they can see the color. Maybe they can feel the texture and the little bit of bumpiness of the orange. And if you've done a good job, you've shown that the inside of an orange is a very different experience from the outside of an orange. And then, well, auditory features, probably not so much unless there's a little squeak, but they probably won't hear the squeaking from the cutting of the orange. So probably not so much for auditory. Remember the importance of tactile vocabulary and rich verbal descriptions. And again, your TVI that I referenced earlier will be your guide for this. So we want to build the child's knowledge of tactile vocabulary, and also we want to use rich verbal descriptions as the child becomes ready. Just as when you're traveling in an environment, someone who is blind, not just those who are deafblind, will appreciate having some information about the environment. And if they are linguistic, they can tell you what they would like you to include in the descriptions if you're traveling with them. Consider positioning for tactile exploration then, and think deeply about how the child is building meaning through the experiences. We're learning a lot more about touch, that's for sure, and there's some really good work on it. And of course, the new, more recent topics like haptics are related to tactile considerations. So it is important to understand the idea of parts to whole learning versus whole to parts. Hearing sighted people have the privilege of learning whole to parts. We can look at something and catch so much information as I gaze out into the room I'm in, and then I can focus in on something particular. It is much, much more demanding cognitively to see or touch or hear parts of something and then have to assemble all of those parts into some sort of meaningful, sensible whole. We do not write about that enough as a field. And that applies both to deafness, blindness, and deafblindness, parts to whole learning, cognitively demanding. When you're selecting representations, please avoid miniatures. Much of the detail in miniatures is expressed in colors, so if you can see it, it can help you understand it, but you can't touch it. So we have to really think about the quality of the representation in terms of it tactually, what's experienced then. Watch the tactile quality of any textures you might use. They change over time. I want to go back to an idea as I'm talking about appropriate representations. If you're working with a student who has an inappropriate representation, but somehow they manage to learn its meaning, you don't get rid of it. Keep it. So if there is a miniature in an object schedule, for example, but the child already knows the meaning, don't change it just because it wasn't ideal when they first set out to learn it. We don't want to destroy what they know. So we want to teach the inside and outside of objects when it's appropriate and necessary, like the orange that I gave you an example of. And these ideas then, these tactile considerations, apply to teaching object calendar systems, also known as anticipation shelves. Remember the importance of repetition for all of these lessons then. So this is a picture of someone who was one of my students, and then I saw this picture on Google Images, I think it was, um, of her. So let me read the descriptions. This photo shows a teacher and her student who is deafblind. The teacher squats down to be eye level with her student as they share visual and tactile attention over two pictures on a black slant board. So this has, let me go back to the picture itself and make a couple of comments. So she's got it on a slant board and it's black because that enhances the child's use of vision. Obviously, the child has functional vision because they are using pictures here. They looks like it might be a photograph actually. And she is also maintaining contact through touch, right? So too often people present materials or signs outside the child's visual field. So you really have to know not only the child's acuity for appropriate enlargement, but the child's visual field. That really needs to be understood by everyone. And the intervener can help people to understand, just show them where they need to hold something in order for a child to see it. I thought about that a lot this past week when I observed a child and whether the materials and the signs were actually visually accessible due to her field loss. All right, let me pause here and see if you have any questions. I know someone was going to help with questions in the chat. I'm not sure if that was you, Heidi, that said that.
Yep, that is Heidi, and I do
Okay.
not see any questions in the chat, but
Oh,
I do need to say this, Susan. We have never had 63 people
oh,
participate. So, uh,
goody.
yeah, so, and they're still on,
Now,
like,
now, now don't any of you get swept away, right? With these
that's right.
terrible weather you have.
That's right. Yeah, we just actually where I live in Dane County, we just are issued a tornado warning. So,
Oh, are you
um,
going to go to the basement too?
you know, I'm not, I've survived 54 years of tornado warnings. And
Oh,
so I haven't heard a tornado siren, so it's not really close enough
okay.
for me to be concerned yet.
Yeah, when you hear the siren, we'll know if you disappear then.
Yeah, and Magdalena is saying, not a chance. This is so interesting. Thank you.
Okay, great. I might also say, if you later think of something, I don't think I put my email on the PowerPoint, but it's Susan, Susan, dot Bruce, Bruce, at bc dot edu.
I dropped it in the chat.
Oh, that's a good idea. I would have had trouble talking and doing that at the same time, so I appreciate it, Heidi. All right, now we're going to get into the lessons, but think of all the foundational information that you have now when you head into this section of the talk about the lessons. So first, let's talk about story boxes. There actually are two different categories of story boxes. Story boxes will also always be individualized to each child, but they are not necessarily personalized. And that is because a story box can be developed on a commercially produced book. Therefore, it's not really about the child's personal lived experiences, is it? But a story box can also be a selection of things you've gathered while having an experience with the child. Like maybe I've had some children visit my home, or the park example that I used earlier, where you pick things up and you put them in a bin, and then you go back to the classroom or the family home if you're a parent, and you share some communication that's appropriate to that child about the experience and those objects that you selected. So we're thinking again saliency and what was important to the child. So again, story boxes are always individualized. Only some of them will be personalized. Others will be used, they'll be paired with a published book, and I'll show you some examples. So remember that if you're doing a personalized lesson, it's best if you actually collect the objects for the story box, which may not ever turn into a book, or it might later on. So you could move from a story box to an experience book later. But it's best if those objects are collected with the child or the learner. And so, again, the importance of saliency and thinking about which objects best represent what is salient to the child, most important, most memorable to the child, and watch for their emotional reactions and their attention. So, this is an example of materials that go, you don't see the box, but these are materials from a story box that go along with the commercially published book, The Hungry Caterpillar, which so many of us know. Now, we might want to use real fruit. That would be better, wouldn't it? But it's just an example to get you thinking then. So that slide again showed objects for the hungry caterpillar. Here's another one with Goodnight Moon. This one's more complex. I'll read the description in a moment, but you see the various objects in the slide, and you also can see some tangible symbols that are placed on a black background. So they're pairing something more complicated, more abstract, with objects that are more concrete. And it could be they're trying to bridge one from another. I've also personally bridged kids from objects to pictures by pairing them and then fading one back. So that slide showed a photograph of the book Goodnight Moon, and it displays objects associated with that book as well as a set of tangible symbols. This is an excerpt from a lesson that I observed a teacher deliver, a wonderful lesson. And she took a commercially published book, Under My Hood I Have a Hat. She had a box of objects that corresponded to the events in the book. And she took the book apart, as you can see in this slide, and she affixed each page then to a black background. And in some pages also include a tactile feature. Now, the reason for the rings that bind the book is so that the child can more easily turn pages. You know how when young children or any of us turn a page and the binding is just so tight that it doesn't lay flat. And that makes it more difficult for them to learn that particular book handling skill. So in that photo is a book cover showing a young child wearing a red hooded jacket and a yellow scarf. So for the kids with low vision, we could also talk about color, couldn't we? And then the other pages of this book were, she separated the picture and the text. So she put the text on one page and the picture that corresponded on another page. And she did the print in white on a black background. And you do notice some glare here. For this particular child, she had, I don't want to say a lot of vision. That's not a good way to put it. But she had sufficient vision that wasn't as big of an obstacle. And as a practical matter, as teachers, even though we're trying to reduce glare and that's a priority, we're also thinking about durability of materials and wet fingers or drool or something else that might interfere with the materials lasting for a while, because this takes a little time, doesn't it? So that photo showed a line from one page of a book that was duplicated in white print and placed on a black background. So she was making the text more visually accessible for the child. And so this is another page from the same book, and you can see that she's adding tactile features here. The photo shows a young child in a red jacket with a scarf. Tactile features include the felt and the scarf, which is a ribbon tied in a bow. All right, so I hope you get the general idea. You may have a story box that represents an experience and there's no book with it. It's a personalized literacy lesson. You might have a story box that represents events in a commercially published book. And so that is individualized. They are both individualized, but the example with the commercially published book is not personalized because it is not about the child's life experiences. So a personalized storybook then, story box, excuse me, is about a shared experience, or a story box may again represent events in a published book. So the materials you'll need will be a container of some sort, the box, which could be a bin that you bought at the dollar store, and the objects that you've selected while remembering the principle of saliency. You'll also be thinking about key vocabulary and what form of communication you will express that vocabulary in, and maybe what you might anticipate the child expressing. And you can ask yourself if there might be a connection to the general education curriculum. So, if in your school the child is going to, all children are supposed to connect to the general curriculum. That's part of our responsibility now. If the child is not readily understanding, which most often happens, some concepts that are being shared in the general education classroom, a story box might be a way to represent some experiences that you provide as an intervener or as a special educator to support or back up comprehension of what's being taught in the general education curriculum after you've determined that it's a worthwhile thing to do, a worthwhile use of the child's time. When you are coordinating a story box with a published book, you're going to have to think about how to organize the exploration of the objects with the reading. So the book I just showed you, the excerpts from, the teacher gave the child time to explore the story box of objects before she read, and then she did some key pauses to offer the child an opportunity to engage with the objects again. If you only engage with the objects as they come up in the story, it might create so many interruptions that it becomes more difficult for the child to comprehend the story. So it's something you have to consider with the child. And of course, you're going to have to think about your positioning and the child's positioning and the materials. Some strategies then could be that you might have your story box and you might also have an all done bin. And for the kids with low vision, I really like just having an all done bin that is red and associating red with all done or finished and stop, all similar concepts. So they might explore these objects and then put them in the finished bin. So again, you're going to individualize the lesson regardless of what type of story box it is. You're going to think about the length of the lesson, pacing, prompting, reinforcement, wait time, etc. These stories, if you're developing a personalized story box, will take you some time to develop, but they don't need to be long. A book for a story box that you create could become an experience book, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it may just be several pages long. So you may shift it into being an experience book later. For now, we'll stick with story boxes. So repeat the experience with the story box, share conversations, don't rush. You can integrate this into a shared reading experience. Yes, you can read objects, that's fine. And this will help them to call up memories then, especially the shared memories. So the same teacher that developed the Girl in the Hood book that I just shared with you, Under the Hood, this was a picture from her classroom that I took. So you can see the red finished bin. And I noticed she had a red container for things when they were finished with them during circle time. She taught preschool level. So she used red always, as I mentioned, for all done. And the kids started that way. And in that school, that practice continued across different grade levels, which was very helpful. And then you can see the blue boxes are story box bins. So in this case, These are story boxes about commercially published books then. And she has labeled them and she has some pictures on there for the kids who have low vision who might be able to know what those mean, but also perhaps mostly for adults. So the kids and adults have ready access to this. And this was not the entirety of her literacy area. This is just one segment of it then. So the teacher has stored each story box in a blue bin. And when they engage in a read aloud or shared reading, the students place objects in the red bin, which represents all done with that particular object then. I'd like to show you this next example because I mentioned to you that writing can happen in different forms of communication, that we extend our view of literacy, including writing, beyond print and braille. So this is a sequence board shown with objects, although I'd rather them be real objects rather than plastic fruit. And you can see they're paired with line drawings that are somewhat iconic. They're not as complex as many of the line drawings, and they're using color as another feature to help the child learn the meaning. So in this way, the events of the Hungry Caterpillar's story can be shown in a left to right sequence as a writing experience. The background is black, and there are 5 actual objects on the background, and above each one is a line drawing representing that object. In the foreground, there is a switch with a representation affixed to it and a copy of the book being represented. So we see a switch here that must have some kind of a message related to the story or about sequence, perhaps. I mentioned earlier paths to literacy. So this slide is just a resource for you on easy to create story boxes for students with visual impairments that would be relevant for children who are deafblind as well. All right, so let me pause there and see if there are any questions about experience books. Excuse me, about story boxes.
Sorry,
This
this
is
is Heidi. It takes me a while to find my cursor. We got new computers, and then I never can find where my cursor goes.
Okay.
There are currently no questions. So
Okay.
yes, and we're still have a strong participation here. So it says Rose is saying, oh, we have someone that says, if you have a child with no vision, can you add Braille?
If you have a child with no vision, could you add Braille? Those are kids that would need Braille. Yes. We label with Braille long before the child even knows a single letter of Braille. It may take years for the child to learn a few letters in Braille. I've seen kids that have had that happen and gone on to be really good readers of Braille. So just like we would want sighted children to have exposure to print, we would want blind children and deafblind children who might have changing visual conditions or a visual acuity that might lead us to believe that Braille could be an option in the future for them or a need in the future, we should expose them to the Braille. Yeah.
And then Rose says, I'm so excited to try these with my daughter slash student. This is such a great concept. Yeah, so Rose is a mom and slash intervener.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and someone says, is there an organization or foundation that actually makes story boxes that you're aware of?
No, I'm not. Most of us, we just make them ourselves. As I said, no, those images I found that went with the commercially produced books, that type of story box, you can find those object kits some places. So those were like from Google Images, I believe. And I've seen them in schools before. But most of the time, we collect the objects with the child because we want to honor the concept of saliency, right? So we don't use the commercial sets, but I put it on there in case it might be relevant for someone, on today's session then.
And then Karen says, no questions because Susan is covering this topic so well.
Oh, Thanks.
And
This is getting a little late for this old girl, let me tell you, but I'm
yeah.
trying to hang in there.
Anne says, for middle school and secondary school students with story boxes, have you seen a graphic novel used or novels? We are trying Geronimo
Oh,
Stilton and Alex Rider right now.
why not? There's no limit to the book you could represent in a story box. There is no limit. Pick out what you think would be most interesting to the child, and you could also think about the concepts that you want the child to understand. What a great way to connect what might be happening in the general education curriculum, too, if they're reading that kind of book. And they do now. That's a great question. But no, I have not personally seen one done, but I can sure imagine how to do it, just the
And so
same
then,
as the others.
so Brenda had the question earlier about Braille, and she followed up saying that they've been exposing Braille to the student for years, but he is just now getting it in 11th grade and is taking off with it.
Thank you so much. I've written a story about a boy whose mother's allowed me to share his name. His name is Colby. And the school gave me permission, a very famous school gave me permission to share his story as well. And the school was going to stop teaching him Braille because it had been years and he did not know a single symbol. I got him at the beginning of the year, and in the spring, he was making fun of his teacher, well, smirking at his teacher with albinism because she didn't have enough vowels that were in Braille to spell out a word. I was just blown away. Sometimes in deaf blindness, it clicks, and that distancing piece is huge. If we taught to distancing, we would get more kids to language sooner. So you keep practicing and practicing and practicing because Braille is abstract. So we don't have, other than object representations, another way to be tactile like that with them for literacy, for advanced literacy. And yeah, sometimes it clicks, and once it clicks, they really take off with it. But the mother, said, "Oh, could we just have him learn a few Braille letters this year?" And boy, he learned them all. And he is a fluent Braille reader, and thank God she insisted on it because he later used Braille also with speech generating device, which was not something we would have ever anticipated when he was young. But enough said about it. But I've written about him, and you can see one of the Oxford books that there's a story about him over time and how he learned. All right, so let's talk experience books now. So, experience books are individualized and personalized because they're always about the child's experience or experiences. They are best if they are created with the child. You've had it, especially if you've been fortunate enough to have the shared experience. And they don't have to be about fancy things. I'll show you some real examples from classrooms in a minute here. But it could be like I've seen them on making a smoothie, my morning routine for older students who don't need us to pay as much attention to the getting them excited about everything. They can be about daily experiences, in other words, as well as special events in their life. They are best if created with the child again, and preferably you will collect objects with the child during the experience, and you're going to remember that concept of saliency, which I've been drilling in. Excuse me, I tried to hit the admit button and skip over a slide. Here we go. All right, so watch the affective responses, watch what they touch, watch what they show emotion to, what they pay attention to, and keep thinking about the vocabulary that they really need to learn to improve their quality of life. Think deeply about that. Label these experience books in print and in Braille. In print, because some of the adults might not read Braille, and we want them to be consistent, especially with some of that key vocabulary you want emphasized. You want them to say the same things when they read the book with the child or to the child. They can use pictures and line drawings if the child has sufficient vision. Make sure you understand the ophthalmology reports on the child. These personalized books will trigger memories of the experience. And here's that distancing. When they are shared, an environment that's different from the one where the experience took place, you are now working on distancing. So, this is a classic literacy lesson that's attuned to teaching distancing. The child should increasingly assume more responsibility for writing and reading, which really means you invite them and encourage them to take more responsibility for reading and writing the experience books. So, these can be co constructed, should be. And you should store them where the child may locate them. So one of the children, no more than one child, I know several children who I knew from the time they were preschoolers to adulthood, and their parents kept a collection of these experience books. Another child, I saw at least 2 dozen of these books that were made at school across her school years in a single location, and they were accessible to her. And I thought, it occurs to me, this might be a little bit of a cheap explanation in a way, but it reminds me of how adults sometimes like to look at photo albums and share old memories and see what happened when they were younger or see what they looked like and so on. So these experience books, even though the child may be fully literate, may be a fluent signer, might be speaking, might be reading Braille fluently, they may still enjoy going back to these old experience books. Oh, like a baby book would be another example where you go back and revisit things from your childhood. And I've had parents tell me how much their kids love to do that and they don't want them to be put away. So they just have a bookcase filled with these things at home, these experience books. So this is a cover of a blank experience book. It only has like maybe 3 or 4 pages, and it's I think it's like Velux. I'm not sure what you call it, maybe Velux materials, so things stick to it quite readily. Velcro sticks to it. And then I just happened to have an old tangible symbol from an activity I did. And so I stuck it on one of the pages. There's Velcro on the back of that um, mounting for that object symbol. One thing I will say to you about mounting these symbols, sometimes it's best to not put them on a background mount. So this ball, um, the way it feels is going to change once you affix it to a surface, right? And this one is not so critical as something maybe in a different shape, where some of the key features might now be anchored to a background mount, like this white background here, making it more difficult for the child to understand what it is. So make sure they've had ample opportunity to do that parts to whole exploration, especially if it's a larger thing, and do that before you affix it to a background then. The advantage of the background is that they can distinguish the difference between when the object is an object and when it's now a representation for an object or an activity, which, by the way, is particularly difficult for children with autism and is one of the reasons why tangible representations might be contraindicated for some of them. So this is a sample from an experience book from one of the children I was mentioning who had dozens of them in her classroom, at least 2 dozen of them. I saw the collection. And they just went on a simple walk, near the school or on the school grounds. And then they came back and wrote a story about it. So now she signs, right? She has low vision, but she needs enlarged print because of her low vision. And she was able to sign what she wanted to write about. And she picked what she gathered up and put into a container and brought back and put in a story in an experience book then. So the page says, we sat on a rock and took pictures. Next to the word rock, an actual rock is glued on the page, and the page is bound in a ring binder, just for ease of handling again, due to some motor challenges. This child also used her iPad. She had low vision, but her mother would record experiences they shared over the weekend or at night and send it back on an iPad. And she loved seeing her mother on the screen with her, seeing herself, and could sign, concept about herself while viewing that, and then would write a story in print with her teacher. So that's another way to work on distancing, isn't it? And here's another sample page. This page includes a small branch with leaves to represent the trees that they noticed along the way. And it's labeled, we walked some more and we saw trees. This is another one they did. They did a whole book just on seasons. And they also included like key events across seasons, including her birthday. Now, I will say something negative here, although I try not to do that. Do watch your use of glue. Now, in this case, this child is primarily using her vision, as opposed to being primarily a tactile learner. So for her, she's going to see that pink candle. So it's not of great importance. But if she were a different learner who had no functional vision or very little functional vision, that glue on that candle would then be a problem, although it is not now for her. So what would happen is the child's feeling it, and that extra glue, it's hard to distinguish what's glue and what's the object. It kind of morphs together. So you do want to watch the quality of the tactile representation, including how you've affixed it to a background then. So this is a book about the seasons, including celebrating her birthday. This is another page from the Seasons Experience book about Easter. And you can see that there's a half of an Easter egg and very large print here. And a rather complex word, celebrate, right? So she's getting more advanced vocabulary as a secondary student. So that photo shows another page from the book about Easter, and a plastic egg is glued to a background mount that is then stuck to the page. So let's think about instructional decisions then and strategies. We want to select objects with the child, as I've talked with you about already, create the experience book itself with the child. Now that sometimes is easier said than done, especially if you got a wiggly kid and more short attention span, or they don't want to do it. So do the best you can. You may not be able to do a lot of shared creation with young children, or maybe due to behaviors. You want to connect emotions from the actual experience to shared reading. And you want to integrate the book handling skills that your TVI will be able to share with you. So things like top and bottom of page, left to right, turning the page, and so on. And words like what's next, next, first, second, and so forth. In fact, that sequence board I showed you about the hungry caterpillar would be a really nice one to think about first, second, third with some learners when they're ready. So design roles for the child and for you for shared reading. In the beginning, it might be that they're going to actively engage in touching the entire representation. And maybe you're going to relate that to an object that's similar or the same. Later on, there'll be more conversation and more reading responsibility. And make sure, again, these are in an accessible place in your classroom or home. So again, you can go to Paths to Literacy to learn about tactile experience books. But remember, some children who are deafblind have sufficient functional vision and stable visual conditions that allow them to use photos or to use pictures. And you'll read the vision reports to get an idea of what would be appropriate. So that's just a picture of another resource from Paths to Literacy. Let's go a little more advanced now and think a little bit about tactile illustrations that happen in storybooks. And you might have created them. You might have added these tactile features. So these are intended to support meaning making, right? And they might be 2D or 3D. And so we need to think a little bit about exploration through touch, or what's known as haptic exploratory procedures. And Bara has written about this in recent years, about these haptic exploratory experiences that the kids have. And you can watch to think about how you want the child to explore something, but make sure it's not this brief touch. Even when they're doing the daily schedule, too often they're not really identifying what it is. So teach them to explore the object with their hand. And so Bara and others that he worked with found that sometimes the kids moved their fingers back and forth to learn more about the outer shape. They sometimes use a single contact and didn't really engage in movement. And sometimes they pinch at it, and sometimes they just do a surface sweep with their hands. So watch how the children are touching it, and get some advice from your TVI. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on and then see if there are questions, because we're at about 8:13, I think, right now. So shared reading is different than read alouds. Read alouds are when an adult or significant other reads to the child. And so the child or learner is in a passive mode, aren't they? Shared reading or interactive reading is when you take turns. There's some kind of a role the adult is not always in control of everything or in control of reading the whole book. The child or learner has some role then. The adult would generate opportunities to connect to the child's experiences. So, what's in the text relates to the child's experiences. And shared reading could occur with an experienced book. So now we're getting tricky. Or it could occur with a commercially published book. Or you could create a simplified version. Like maybe you'll have your own version of that graphic novel then for a child that is appropriate to the child who's deafblind. They will create extension activities, and this is a major role for interveners. So you're always going to be concerned with meaning making, and school interpreters also have this role that goes beyond what we might associate with other interpreting types of situations, where we want to make sure that the child has experiences to ground what's being communicated, right? And we provide those. So it's a different way to think about extension activities then. You will also need to do some comprehension checks, but please avoid asking question after question after question. When we ask questions, we put the kid in the mode of answering, and answering can become quite a passive kind of experience. You want to engage the child or adult who you're sharing this reading experience with to engage in conversation. So allow enough time. Thinking about the environment then in which you're going to share reading. We want to think about who the reading partners are or who they are in a particular situation. Is it the intervener, teacher, therapist, parent? We want to think about the visual characteristics of the setting, including the lighting. Avoid having glare on the child's face, or even if it's not directly on their face, they might feel it, the heat, and be drawn to visually look at it instead of looking at the literacy materials. Consider auditory characteristics if they have some functional hearing, the noise level, background noises, and so on, how many chairs are going to be moving. I could add to this, think about attention. I put reduce distractions, but think more broadly actually about attentional strategies with the child. Think about the time of day that shared reading occurs, what's optimal for the learner. In a study that Chris Brum did and that I supported later with him, it was interesting to learn about the different ways people approach this and the times of the day that they tended to do it. So interveners have the role to make sure that these appropriate conditions occur and make suggestions in a professional way to support other professionals to do so. So in Chris Brum's study of shared reading, of which he has a number of publications, there was a major survey with 84 participants, 42 teachers, 36 parents, 6 interveners across 25 states. That's actually a nice group of participants for a study of this type and for this population being deaf blindness and lower incidence. And then there were interviews. So surveys followed up by a select group of interviews. The main goals of his research was to determine types of literacy activities that they engaged in and to learn more about their strategies. So I wanted to share with you the themes that came out of the observations in the interviews. So these were the most important ideas from this large pool of professionals and parents. One of the themes that they talked about or demonstrated a lot was thinking around gaining and holding the child's attention. They found that physical proximity, relating the child to background experience, so background experience related to the literacy, pointing out aspects of text that were of great interest. Okay, so maybe we exaggerate our sign a little bit. We show more emotion when we know we've hit a topic that they're going to love. We pause. Labeling pictures, clarifying meaning, the traditional strategy of prediction, perhaps, for some learners when they're ready, the use of pause or wait time, emotion. Some people, and I had this in a study that I was doing too, tie in music with reading, which can be really effective, including singing with text, and also sound effects. And then, of course, reciprocity or turn taking. The second theme was the use of child-guided strategies. So this is when we follow the child's interests and we let them lead the curriculum to some extent as well. And this is the theory that we most ascribe to in deafblindness. However, they also talked about another theory, which we could call behavioral. I've chosen to label it systematic instruction because so many people in deafblindness are a little put off by mentioning the importance of behavioral theory, but we all use these principles. So, systematic instruction, we have to be planful. So, yes, we're going to follow the child's lead and we're going to capitalize on their interest, but we still have to be planful and thoughtful about how we deliver most of the lessons we teach. So, we're going to think about pacing, prompting, pauses, reinforcement. How are we going to deal with mistakes, error correction, and repetition? Those are all systematic instruction principles. The fourth theme they showed us and talked about was vocabulary acquisition strategies. The way they thought about core vocabulary, as it might be meant in their district or in their field, but also just key vocabulary that the family and others wanted this child to learn. So when you look at the child and you think about their experience, you want to consider what would this child need to learn to express to have a better life, right? Just what you would hope someone would do for you. So that could be the key vocabulary. The fifth was drawing and writing strategies, and that one kind of surprised me because the Europeans do a lot more with drawing as part of a child-guided approach. But drawing and writing included the co-construction of those experience books. So when you make them with the child, that is writing. Touch and tactile strategies were important. Comprehension strategies were important, like highlighting big ideas, simplifying the text. So you might take large pictures from a commercially produced book and pair it with text that's simplified. We do that naturally with younger readers, don't we, who are hearing sighted? Same idea. And they thought a lot about how to combine communication forms. So, what communication forms or mode were appropriate, and how did they combine with each other to give a fine literacy experience? So, interveners then would need some preparation and support, perhaps from the teacher of the deaf and also from the teacher of students with visual impairments, in order to enact these. That's assuming you don't have a deafblind specialist on your team, and many teams do not. I also want to share with you a book that is quite recent. I think it was a 25 publication that Chris Brum did. I have a copy of it downstairs. It is great, and it really is a practical guide. So it's interactive reading for learners with extensive support needs, a practical guide for teachers. And it is like a how-to book, just as the name would imply. And so if you want to move beyond reading to someone to sharing reading or making reading experiences that are interactive with the learner who's deafblind, then this book will help you. So this book goes beyond thinking about the population of children who are deafblind, but he has a lot of experience and knowledge in deafblindness, so you'll be able to see that across the book and learn to use the ideas in it then. And then I provided you with 4 pages of references. The boy that I told you the Braille comments about, here's his name right on this 2008 publication. And then I've written a longitudinal case on him that was published in 25 or 26, so just out. And you can see the Brum publications about his shared reading or interactive reading ideas and so on. This Farrell, Bruce, and Luckner publication is about the state of evidence for instructional practices in each of the sensory areas. Kay Farrell did blindness, I did deafblindness, and John Luckner did deafness, hard of hearing. And then we published some other things after that. So let me pause here. It looks like we have about 5 minutes. Well, maybe I won't end the show in case I need to go back to a slide. So let me see if you have any questions.
So this is Heidi. There was one question earlier that said, I like using story boxes and experience books. They can be challenging for me because I need to provide ASL and tactile ASL while supporting my primary and middle school student with hand under hand guidance. I help guide their arms and hands so they can feel and follow the story or experience book through tactile input. it can be challenging, especially when trying to support them in ways that feel natural and manageable. Do you have any suggestions for how I can support my students more easily and effectively?
hmm I think the answer to that would be individualized for each child. So I don't want to cop out, but I will tell you, just this happened to me this past week, actually Thursday, when I was, no, last Monday, when I was out on a consultation. One of the requests from a team member was to come up with a protocol, and that of how to combine the communication forms, like how do you present the material, where do you present it, and how do you combine signing with touching materials, right? And also, they were using switches for some of her responses, single button switches. And what else were they doing? Oh, they had tangible representations as well as real objects. So that's a lot to take in. And I do appreciate that when you're doing all of that, so much is happening that it becomes difficult perhaps to keep a flow to a literacy lesson, doesn't it? Because you're trying to provide all of that. So I think it would depend on each child and which communication form they most comprehend right now. So I would make sure that I'm giving them ample experience with that. And as I said with the commercial book with the corresponding story box, I like that idea of having a child explore the objects first. And that young child that I observed was probably 4 years old, maybe, yeah, I think she was about 4 years old. I think that satisfied her a lot to touch them before the storybook and to sign about them. And she had some speech as well. So she expressed about the objects. And then when they got into the book, yes, there were times she also wanted to go back to the objects, and the teachers certainly allowed that to occur, but it didn't happen as often as it would have if she hadn't initially provided the experiences with it. You see what I'm saying? Because some of that touching and conversation then occurred before the sharing of the book itself. So I think this idea then, I'm going to have to think about this about the child I saw last week, but I understood the question that they need to understand kind of like a sequence of how to do this. And now I have to learn more from them and think about whether it might be a little different depending on what the activity is, right? So that's a tricky question. If I saw more about the child or a video, I could probably tell you, but the best I can say now is individualize it and really emphasize what the child comprehends, but also emphasize the form of communication that you're building toward if those two things are a little bit different then. Like maybe the child is understanding some tangible representations or symbols, but you're really building for the child to learn some expressive signs. Heidi, is there anything else?
No, that was the last question. And this has been fascinating, and I'm glad that we record it because I need to go back and watch this a couple of times, and I have a feeling that I will be sharing this and referencing it as we're out and about. The one thing that just kept sticking out to me, and I want to say this to you, Susan, is I you're elevating the role of the intervener. And this is something that I don't think is done enough for our interveners in the field. There's so much that they have on their plate in supporting students who are deafblind, to help our classroom teachers be able to do the great work they do. Look at what you have shown our interveners that they can also do to support that. I love all of this. So thank you. And thank you to our interveners. Yay,
Yes, you're important models
for sure.
for other professionals.
And the consistency, you provide that consistent piece. Like,
Yeah,
like when you're outside at recess, you saw whether or not they gravitated to the sandbox, or if they gravitated to the scooter, or if they gravitated to
that's
a
right.
specific student. You're the one paying attention to that. And that, as Susan was talking about today, those are those critical elements to bring back to them as learning experiences in literacy, and in vocabulary development, and just that whole piece around reminiscing. I kept hearing Robbie Blaha actually a little bit
Oh, did you?
as you're
Probably.
talking about the
Uh,
reminiscing, right?
uh-huh. And
So I love
saliency, those experiences that the interveners share with the child will help them to be able to identify what is most salient to the child,
exactly. I
which
love
might
some,
not be what we want them to have as something
right?
salient, but it is.
Yes, and what we think should be the most obvious is not
Yeah.
necessarily what they're going to choose.
Yeah.
Um,
And although we try to create very positive experiences, I have had to represent something very negative that accidentally happened to a child because that was most salient about it. That's what they were going to remember. And I had to think, oh, gee, do I want to put that in the book? Because then they might feel unhappy or they might get angry when we get to it. But it'd be dishonest to not include that, right?
no, it is true. I worked with a
Respect.
family and they had a house fire.
Oh,
And the
boy.
student didn't understand why the child didn't understand why they couldn't go back to their house. And so
Oh,
he
yeah.
would go out to the garage and sit in his car seat. And that was his way of telling his mom
Oh,
he wanted to go home. And
yeah.
so we finally had to sort of use what you were talking about tonight, take him back. He had to experience, he had to go back to the
Yeah.
site, and then they had to use that to build a book so that when he would go back to the car seat, they could pull out the book and talk about it so they didn't have to go back to, the dangerous site. But
Yeah, that's a great example, a sad one, but a real life example. And to ignore that is disrespectful, isn't it?
absolutely, you can't ignore it because he was saying, I want to go home.
Yeah. So it's lived experience, not our sanitized version of it, right?
Very true. Very
Yeah.
true.
It's tough. It's challenging is for us, but we have to do it.
So everyone is sending out a ton of thank you, thank you, thank yous, great information that you've made their night. Um, so I just want to point out, as I mentioned at the beginning, you'll see two links in the chat. One is our post survey for feedback about this presentation. And the second is if you'd like a certificate of participation and or CEUs. So thank you so much, Susan, for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
Keith and Gina and Mary. I don't know if Mary's still on. So, oh yeah, you are. I see you, Mary. Mary, Keith, and Gina, thank you so much for
Yeah.
interpreting us with us this
Thank
evening.
you.
So thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great night.
Okay. Bye-bye.
The WDB TAP logo is displayed and reads WESP DHH, Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project, WDB TAP.